Welcome, everyone. My name is Duke Ryder. I head up the 10 Across project here at Arizona State University. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. I've been looking forward to this discussion around nonprofit journalism and democracy for some time. I think it's very timely and relevant to the circumstances we see in this country. And I couldn't be happier to have the distinguished guests and panelists with us today that you're going to hear from shortly. For those of you who are not familiar with 10 Across, it's our contention that if you look at the US I-10 corridor from Los Angeles to Jacksonville, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, you see the future of the United States. This is where you see the three largest states, rapidly growing metros like Phoenix or Houston that are very diverse, and a variety of other issues that the entire country, frankly, needs to deal with. Think about climate change, demographic change, changing economics, even the global situation that's impacted this part of the country. So we have been building the 10 Across project with an idea of using it as a lens on the future. And this particular corridor, this geography, is just ripe with opportunity for exploration of critical issues like journalism, like democracy, which we'll be doing today. We will be taking questions during the end of this discussion, so be thinking of those as we go on. With that, I want to introduce my colleague, Susan Goldberg, who's going to be today's moderator. Susan is uniquely qualified to lead this discussion, given her history and what she's doing for us now. She is at Arizona State University, serving in two capacities, which actually intertwine in this discussion. Issues of sustainability loom large in this quarter, and so she has an appointment with the Global Futures, College of Global Futures here at ASU, and she's also the Vice Dean at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. Susan has a distinguished history of leading as the CEO of an editor-in-chief of National Geographic, but also served as the editor of papers, including the Cleveland Plain Dealer, my hometown previously, the San Jose Mercury News, excuse me for tripping on that, and others. But she's a highly qualified journalist, great moderator, and we're delighted to have Susan lead this discussion today. Susan, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Duke, and thanks for having this terrific conversation. Hosting this is a real honor for me, and I'm delighted to be joined by four groundbreaking editors this morning who in different ways are going to help address a true shortage in our nation, which is the shortage of local news. You know, in about the last 20 years, about 2,000 local news organizations have shut their doors, largely a victim of the sea change in how local news is financially supported in the digital age. But other local newspapers, including a newspaper where I used to be the editor, the San Jose Mercury News that Duke mentioned, have been bought up by private equity firms that are bleeding them dry, taking their profits and shrinking them without regard to the impact on journalism that can be produced about local communities. And as we all know, without local news, communities really suffer. And it's certainly not an understatement to say that democracy itself suffers without an informed citizenry. So I'm joined by four editors who have fought back, and let me introduce each of them. And I want to just remind everybody to please send some questions into the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the program. So first, I'd like to introduce Hannah Brown. Hannah is the co-founder and editorial director of the Marjorie, which is Florida's independent reporting outlet dedicated to the critical intersection of social justice and the environment. She is a science communicator and social scientist. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in mass communication, and a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida. Next, we've got Bob Moore. Bob is the CEO of El Paso Matters, which he founded in 2019 to focus on in-depth and investigative reporting about El Paso. He's been a journalist in the Texas borderland since 1986, writing about border issues for the Washington Post, ProPublica, Texas Monthly, and other media outlets. Sara Solovitch is executive director and editor of Searchlight, New Mexico, which is based in San Jose and is a nonpartisan news organization focused on investigative and public service journalism. She's an experienced journalist with investigative long-form stories appearing in Esquire, Wired, Politico, and the Washington Post. And last and certainly not least, Dianna Náñez is executive editor of the Arizona Luminaria, a Phoenix-based nonprofit newsroom dedicated to community-centered journalism. She too is an investigative journalist, narrative writer, and editor who's also worked at the Arizona Republic and taught journalism at ethics and diversity at Arizona State University. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I'm so excited to talk with you about these issues. So as Duke mentioned, the 10 Across project is really based on this transect going from on Highway 10, going from Florida all the way to California. And I'm wondering if each of you could just tell us about some distinctive issues you face in your communities that you feel aren't getting enough attention in the rest of the country. Anybody can start. Maybe I'll just call on Hannah.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this very distinguished panel. And to tell you a little bit about the Marjorie. So we are an independent reporting nonprofit, and we cover social justice and the environment in Florida. And so we really focus on environmental stories and everything that we do in that intersection with how communities are engaged and affected by environmental issues. So for us, the personal experience of climate change impacts and other environmental changes is a major focus for what we are interested in publishing about. And one thing that we're doing is featuring the voices of people who are seeing these changes happen in their own communities. And we do that with our series called Dispatches from a Sinking State. So these are not necessarily journalists, but Floridians who have their own stories to tell. And we just published one of these essays, which was written by Glenda Simmons Jenkins, who's a representative from the Gullah Geechee community in Northeast Florida. And she writes about cultural displacement that occurred in her community after a major road was built through her neighborhood in the 1970s. And she talks about that disruption fragmenting her connection with her community and to her past, her cultural traditions. And she writes about how she's had to seek those Gullah Geechee traditions out and reconnect with that identity throughout her life so she could then bring it to her daughter and, teach it. So we published that last week, and we've already had a lot of interest in people republishing it, which is great because that's part of what we do as a nonprofit news outlet is all of our content is free to read and to republish. And Glenda actually used to be a reporter for a local paper in Northeast Florida, but this is the first time she's gotten to actually put that personal story out, have that published. So our goal is, that by amplifying these stories, we're showcasing that climate change impacts and other environmental changes are happening now, and they're happening in places that people are familiar with and may even love. So we're hoping with this series, we can put power back into people's hands, guiding that storytelling process, but leaving their unique voice.
Well, and we are going to talk a little more, all four of us, or all five of us, I should say, about who gets a voice and why that is so important. But Hannah, before I leave you, can you please tell us just the origins of the name of your organization, the Marjorie? It is a little bit unusual. It's not like, the Searchlight or, El Paso Matters. We all get that. But how does the Marjorie, what does that mean?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, because it is kind of like a niche name. So we are named after Florida's three iconic Marjories, Marjorie Kinnan Rollins, who is the author of The Yearling. So she's probably the most well-known of the three. Marjorie Harris Carr, who is an environmental advocate who fought against the Cross Florida Barge Canal successfully. So if you don't know that story, that's an interesting environmental story that you might want to look up. And then Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is also kind of a more familiar name. Was a journalist in Miami and Everglades advocate. And our publication is environmentally focused, like I said, and it's woman-led. So we use these women as our kind of jumping off points, guiding us in our mission and our reporting.
I love that sense of history. But Sara, let me just jump to you. Can you tell us in New Mexico, what are the distinctive issues that you're facing that you think aren't getting enough attention in the rest of the country that you're shining a light on?
Yes, in fact, and thank you for having me, but that is why we were founded, specifically to provide kind of a third arm to news organizations around New Mexico that no longer have the resources to do investigative journalism. And primarily we look at child and family well-being because children in New Mexico have the worst metrics in the country when it comes to essentially every manner in which you weigh child well-being, when it comes to poverty, education, parental incarceration, environmental degradation, etc. We try to look for issues that are not being handled as a result of by local news outlets that have a daily deadline, expectation, but also by the nationals. So for instance, we just published a story this morning about the fires in New Mexico, but we looked at how local and especially rural New Mexicans regard the US Forest Service and the incredible rancor and rage that people are feeling towards that Forest Service. They see it as a feudal lord, which is how we described it, a kind of, entity that exists in some remote part of the country and has no idea about how to manage the forest in ways that really at least can control some of the devastation and limit the devastation we're seeing. And it was an incredibly powerful story that we spent, our reporters spent weeks on. And we were able to really even identify this story because our reporter comes from this world. She's from one of these small rural towns in northern New Mexico. And just by virtue of knowing people and being part of the community, she very quickly identified this anger that I don't think anyone else has seen.
Yeah, that is such an important story. And the whole question of fire management is really a global issue at this point. And we're seeing a lot of changes, but you're right. I don't think that is a story that we have seen kind of in mainstream, general interest outlets at all. Bob, why don't you tell me what you're doing in El Paso?
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to be joined by some of my wonderful colleagues from across the country. The El Paso Matters was founded for a number of reasons, but I think one of the dominant reasons is El Paso is at the heart of one of the nation's most important and most news-making regions, the U.S.-Mexico border. The national portrayal of our region and our city is grossly inaccurate. And a lot of it's driven by conservative politics and conservative media. But you constantly hear these portrayals of the border region as a war zone that's under invasion. And one of the reasons that narrative has been able to take hold, quite frankly, is the weakening of local media over time. And there's not a voice to sort of create this counter narrative. So we're in the midst of this major national conversation about the border region, and the voices of residents on the border are almost never heard. And the border is much more than about immigration, although immigration is a very important topic. But the border is also an economic and cultural engine for this country, and you never hear about that. And so this portrayal of the border as a war zone and the portrayal of people crossing the border as invaders has real life consequences that have to be understood. It has major economic development consequences for El Paso. What business wants to set up in a war zone? But most importantly, it shapes the lives of the people who live here. In some ways, it even begins to sink into our own psyche, and we kind of question who we are and where we are. But finally, I think that this incorrect portrayal of the border puts people's lives at risk. And on August 3rd, 2019, we saw what happened when false narratives are allowed to take root and expand, when a white supremacist from Allen, Texas, drove 10 hours across the state to come to a Walmart in El Paso early in the morning and murder 23 of our neighbors because he wanted to counter the Hispanic invasion of Texas, is the way he portrayed it. We saw this play out again recently in Buffalo. These narratives are incredibly damaging. and we need to be able to give voice to our residents to be able to fight back. Media alone is not going to fix this, obviously, but I think without strong local media, this community cannot reclaim its own narrative. And so that's part of the reason that we founded El Paso Matters.
Thank you so much for that. I'm so, well, we're going to talk about how to get those stories to break through in just a second. But Dianna, first I wanted to turn to you and just ask, what are the stories in the Arizona, in the Phoenix community that you're covering that really is not being covered otherwise?
Thank you, everybody. I've been valuing everybody's story and why you are passionate and inspired to launch what is not an easy effort. Arizona Luminaria launched with our content in late February, early March. But value-wise, we launched because our three co-founders, women-led, dedicated more than 50 years combined to local journalism. Two of us from the Daily Star in Tucson with 18 years apart, and myself at the Arizona Republic for 15 years. And we just saw personally, professionally, communally, that what happens when your newsrooms are bled dry. What happens to neighborhoods, what happens to democracy, what happens to people, and our places, quite literally. And over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a per capita decrease, from about 22 journalists per capita to 1990 to about 3 now. We've seen massive, deep declines in cuts and consolidation, as Susan said. And we see those numbers and we talk about those numbers, but I think the key for nonprofit local journalism is that it's always the heart of people that lived in these communities, that grew up in these communities, that raised their families in the communities. And the L in front of journalists is really just the heart of what it is to see happens over a matter of years. So what we wanted to do was rebuild from the start, really build with our community, talk to people across Arizona, what they were missing, what we needed to focus on, just what Susan said, what was missing from the national conversation, even in some ways the state and local conversation with this decline over years. So we started with topics that we heard that people are exceedingly interested in, which was equity, which is for many another way of saying inequality, environment, education. Arizona for too many years now has always been at the end of education. And when we talk about valuing our families and valuing our students and valuing our economy, education is a major topic, and we just don't get that depth of journalism. And then the fourth topic we focus on is called community, and it's another way of reframing what it means to be economically and communally valuing what the people want built and what our vision is now and 20 years from now and 50 years from now for our state. One of the first stories that we launched with was a story about mixed status families. One of the things that we decided is that we talk about—
Can I interrupt for 1 second? What do you mean by mixed status families? Mixed
status families. In Arizona, we have large immigrant populations, migrant populations that in some ways were here before the border was here. You hear that saying all the time, right? So that movement back and forth, as Bob said, it's just, that bi-national movement. For so many years, we talked about immigrant advocates or migrant advocates, and we talked about immigrants advocating for themselves. But there's this cross between neighbors, between families, where some family members will have legal status and other families will not have legal status. Your neighbor across the street will have legal status and the family across the street will not have legal status. And there's been this swell of community, quite literally, coming together and saying, it is not fair that my sister does not have legal status, and I have a voice and she has a voice, and we can advocate together. So we published with a story in Spanish and English, and we decided from the beginning that as much as possible, with resources, with time, with investment, we would publish as many stories we could in Spanish. We talk about Spanish communities, speaking communities mattering here, but if we don't publish that in Spanish, then we're not really holding true to our values. So that was one of the stories that when we first launched, we published in Spanish and English. And it talks about really young people coming together and being the push for this and getting a ballot that no one thought was possible onto our November elections, which, if it passes, if the voters decide that they want it, it would allow students without legal status to be able to pay the same tuition rates that in-state students who are residents do, which is happening across our nation in many other states, but it hasn't happened here.
You know, this is so interesting. So the four of you have really talked about stories, and they're all different stories, but the through line to me is that they are all nuanced stories, right? They're stories that paint a picture that is so much more complex and rich and textured than what you generally hear about, you know, the big national screaming stories, right? The big headlines. You don't hear about this complexity very much. So I guess I want to ask you, how can this kind, and I don't know if you're going to have the answers, but I don't know if anybody has the answers, but how can these kinds of stories that can really bring people together around solving some of these issues and really weighing these complex problems, how can that become the narrative rather than the simplistic kind of dumbed down screaming headline stories? And I'd open that to anybody.
Well, I'll just take a stab at it. I think that Searchlight is probably illustrative of every one of these organizations in that we give our stories away for free. So we give our stories to every news outlet in New Mexico. That's our primary concern. They're our primary audience. And that includes TV and radio, but every newspaper and online publication. But we are also reaching out, and we have a lot of success in this, in publishing our stories nationally. So the piece that we just wrote today is in The Guardian and in Rolling Stone. And, you know, we've published in all kinds of other outlets. And I think there's really a hunger for these stories nationally. People recognize that this is a really interesting, complex place. You know, just, you know, as Dianna was saying, it's just filled with people who are, you know, like just have such rich histories. And they bring so many kind of through lines to every story, and they see life in much more subtlety and richness than, you know, than the headlines suggest. So once you find a story like that, and a really good example is the kind of, you know, the stories that we've written about the Navajo Nation. I essentially can, you know, pitch any publication nationally with one of those stories, and people lap it up. They are just really eager for it because there isn't a real, you know, clear understanding. I mean, it just seems so foreign to most people, and yet this is our world.
You know, Bob, you had mentioned what I think is one of the best illustrations of this problem, the situation at the border, you know, the debate about immigration, the kind of hateful rhetoric that we see. Do you have much hope that this more nuanced, complex story, you know, that really talks about the people and the economics and all of these things that are actually going on every day, is that going to get out there?
So I'm going to take off my journalist hat and put on my CEO hat, and because this is the honest answer. Because you asked what's it going to take, and it's going to take money. Right now, market forces in journalism reward the sort of extremist, really hyper-intensive viewpoints getting out there. And there's a lot of money to be made by dividing people and pitting them against each other. The only answer to that is going to be to invest a lot of money in this more nuanced kind of approach. And you know, we're all here representing nonprofit organizations, and you know, nonprofit is not a business model; it's a tax status. We need large investments and small investments from everybody who cares about these issues, and so people who are interested in the health of communities, who are interested in equity issues, who are interested in the protection of human rights. We all need to kind of step up and make the kind of investments that are needed to make this happen. You've heard already today some examples of some just tremendous journalism that's out there. But you know, the reality is this is just a fragment of the ecosystem out there, and we have to become a bigger and bigger piece of this ecosystem. And so it's going to, we're talking billions of dollars here just to rebuild sort of the community infrastructure in journalism that's been lost. So it's a long slog, but we have to get better about telling these stories. And I think we also have to get major nonprofit investors more comfortable with the idea of whatever their cause is, whether it's the environment or whether it's human rights or the protection of immigrants, that part of that investment has to be made in the storytelling around these kinds of issues, particularly in local journalism, where so much of these issues really begin to take root.
Well, let me ask, Hannah and Dianna, I think this all gets down to a trust issue too, right? The role that local journalists have in building trust. I mean, my experience in local news was really that people trusted local journalists, people they knew actually, right? Much more than they trusted the media. But now that we've seen this huge cutback in local journalism, we see the rise of distrust. So can you talk about the connection between those two and how your organizations are trying to change the equation?
Sure. And I just I'm loving hearing all of this. It's just really meaningful to be a part of this conversation and be like, yes, grossly inaccurate coverage. We understand that in Florida as well. Yes, we need funding. All these things are unifying issues. When it comes to trust, I think, we try to be really mindful about our editorial choices and how we approach stories. And we try to take a unifying approach in all that we do. So we're not leading with the conflict of an environmental issue that we're covering, but maybe we lead with a person and their narrative story, or we lead with personal or cultural ties to a place, or maybe we lead with a solution. That trope that many of us grew up with as journalists of it leads can be really hard for audiences to swallow on a regular basis. And in many cases, that instills this sense of divisiveness. So instead, we try to take the slower approach, but kind of like Bob was saying, we don't maybe get as many clicks if we're not putting that conflict, right in front and center, that draw you in with that drama. But we feel, that is a more impactful way to showcase the power of individual stories and how those stories, as well as people's personal values, are interconnected.
I think in stories like climate, it's so important to at least give some sense of solutions. I mean, otherwise people are just going to run screaming from the room saying, we're all doomed, we're all going to die, right? Rather than engage in the content and try to figure out smart ways forward. I don't know, Dianna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that what Hannah's talking about in the very nature of the approach and the intention of being slow and thoughtful, even to the extent of how we start our coverage, right? I mean, that's something that you don't always have the luxury in the corporate model. I think that part of losing trust, if you go back in the arc, you think of a traditional community newspaper, those journalists tended to stay their entire career in that neighborhood, and people got to know, oh, you cover education for our community. Oh, and you cover economic development, and you cover, neighborhoods. And they knew that person for over a decade, right? In corporate models, we see turnover and layoffs consistently, and people that are paid inequitably. And so then therefore they move to another space to be able to raise families or buy a house. And so the nonprofit model tends to be people with roots in that community. So for example, with Bob and Hannah and myself and Sara, you have roots in that community, and you're trying to ensure that the voices of those people in that community and the people that you've built roots with are elevated into these stories. So we take a people-centered approach and a community-centered approach to our coverage. That comes directly from our direct ties. I, in addition to doing our editing and investigative reporting and narrative that I did over the years, led our newsroom's diversity committee for 7 years. And we would hold dialogues, and I would talk with people. And that really came from the roots of my own family, which were immigrants Mexican immigrants, Spanish speakers who were not represented in their local community news. So in our coverage, you go to almost all of our stories and you'll see someone who is impacted by the issue that we're covering. And that is the true change. In a corporate model, they throw a lot at the wall because they have to meet certain shareholder ends, or they choose to meet certain shareholder ends. That's a model. As Bob said, our model is truly nonprofit, and all it is a status. It's a financial status. It means getting invested in. And when we talk about this, if we're going to write a story, and we'll go back to the mixed status families, the young woman, Helen, her parents do not have status, and she talks about waiting until she can reach 21, and she looks at the clock, and all she can think about every single day is, if I can reach 21, then I get to the chance to apply to see if I can find status for my parents. And to me, that is the heart. We don't do coverage for people to think a certain way, to act a certain way. We do coverage for people who want to be informed, to take action in any way they want, but we need to let them meet the people that matter to these stories. That is the difference with our coverage.
Well, I think you get to the heart of something that's so important to, a big question in journalism, which is who gets to tell the stories, right? And why does that matter so much? And I would just open that to the group, that this whole notion of ownership of the narrative. So who gets to tell stories, and why does that matter?
I'll start because Dianna made a number of points that are really important about sort of this grand tradition of local news that we all kind of fondly remember. But I think the reality that we have to be honest with is that a lot of traditional local journalism has been terrible for many reasons. But probably the most important reason has been the voices that have been excluded from those conversations. We have to be honest and acknowledge that much of the problem with journalism in the financial sense that we're in right now is a self-inflicted wound, because we've deliberately excluded communities of color, or if we did include them, it was always at the worst possible moment in their lives. So I think one of the really important things that we're seeing, as Dianna said, with sort of this sort of ground up movement with people with roots in the community, is to try to make sure that it's members of that community who have a chance to tell those stories. And it's not an easy task. We're all very small organizations, but hopefully growing. And I think the only way that communities can grow and prosper is if all people in those communities have access to these outlets and can tell their stories in meaningful ways.
Let me ask somebody else to weigh in on that. I mean, I guess one of the things you bring up, Bob, and I do think it is true, looking back at a long career in local journalism, there was a lot of exclusion of communities unless something terrible happened in one of those communities, then you'd go cover it. And I think that is certainly an approach that, looking back, was clearly not the right approach, and that people have tried to correct. What I wonder, though, is here I'm talking with 4 editors who created new organizations to try to do that. Do you think that the old organizations have an ability to correct, or is there too much of a split in those communities?
I think that there's always an opportunity to correct. Okay. It will not be easy. It's much more difficult in a corporate structure, because you're not, quite literally, the local news org for the corporate structure is often not answering to the local communities. They're answering to someplace at corporate, center. You'll see a lot of coverage now in corporate modeled news orgs where the templates of the stories are running exactly the same, and they're not community based, and then there'll be this small little portion of actual local stories. That's intentional. So to change that system is very difficult. And you're hearing from communities of color, historically marginalized communities, that the systems that exist were not built for us, and journalism is included in that. we have a romantic view. I have a romantic view of journalism, despite what we've seen, despite what we've experienced. But the realities is that, yes, we've talked as an industry and as a community and as a nation for more than 50 years about having parity within our own system, within our own newsrooms. That means having our editors and our publishers and our CEOs look like the communities that we cover, so that then we're ensuring that those experiences match the communities by parity at which we cover. And we are so far from that. So it starts internally and holding ourselves accountable, and it starts externally and ensuring that the voices and the stories that are being told actually are accurate and fair. That level of equity or parity and reflecting our communities and sharing in coverage and internally is truly accuracy. I hesitate to use the word diversity because I think some people don't understand what that means. What it actually means is accuracy in our storytelling and in our coverage. We had a story that we ran, and it was by an artist, a Black artist here, a poet, and he wanted to use poetry as a form of reporting. And so we talked it through. We figured out how we could possibly do this. He wrote an intro as to why journalism needed to open its doors, open its frame of thinking. Otherwise, he would continue to be left out, and people like him would continue to be left out. And then after he has this intro of explaining, we have his poetry on the feeling of gentrification in his community and what's changing for him in the last 20 years that he's lived here. We got so much feedback on that story from journalists and communities alike. The communities were saying, oh my gosh, I see and hear myself in this, where I need more of this. And the journalists that we got notes from said, I would have never thought of allowing a piece like that to be published on our news pages. Thank you for doing that, because now I have to rethink how we address our coverage locally.
Sara, I wanted to bring you into this. I mean, how do you bring in all those voices and really make sure that the community feels included?
I guess I'd just like to go back a tiny bit to say, I loved my years in major newspapers, in big city newspapers. They were like a really wonderful training ground for me. But it became really clear that the powers of the newspaper were really aligned with the powers of the cities that they were, that they were established in. And that was extremely frustrating. And I saw that repeatedly. But to answer your question, I think it has to do with the reporters that, one hires and brings in to, and that's really difficult. I mean, I've been to so many journalism conferences where everybody's talking about diversity and tearing their hair out. Diversity, how do we create diversity and have diversity in our, in our newsrooms? And there's this sense of almost panic that I think a lot of news leaders feel about that. For instance, when you apply for a grant now, they ask for the demographics of your newsroom and of your board. And there's this sense that, you have to, have the numbers have to, work out. And of course, we're all desperate for, to bring in the money. But I mean, I've applied for grants that asked for, the sexual preferences of everybody in the newsroom. And I just found that outrageous and, just didn't apply for that grant. I put that aside. People talk, we talk about these things, these issues in our staff meetings, the sensitivity that stories demand. And once again, bringing in people who may not even have a journalism background. For instance, the reporter, Alicia Inez Guzman, who wrote the story in today's Searchlight, her background is she has a PhD in art history. And I had her write something for us about monuments when a couple of years ago, when there was so much happening with the monuments being torn down. And I loved what she did. And I ended up convincing her to come and work for us as a journalist. And so you're training people, you're mentoring them, it is a learning curve for it was for me, certainly. And but I think it's our job to do that. And it requires a lot of effort and a lot of money, especially when people, when we have these very small staffs and there's a pressure to publish on a regular basis, because that's what our grants demand.
I'm sorry, I disappeared there for a few minutes. But Bob, how do you know that there is the demand for this content?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the heart of the question, and one of the real challenges when you're building out a new news organization is being able to connect with audiences and to know what's important to those audiences too. And that's probably my lessons learned over the last couple of years is that's probably the hardest of the work that we've done, and we probably haven't paid nearly enough focus to it as we should. But I'll just use kind of one of the bread and butter things of a lot of nonprofit news organizations, and that's local election coverage. We El Paso, for those who don't know, is the 22nd largest city in the United States. 800 or about 680,000 people in the city, 840,000 people across the county. Major urban area. Horrible history of voter participation. But I think one of the reasons for that has been that potential voters have not been asked to participate. They've never been informed. So we've really focused a lot of our efforts on nuts and bolts things like voters guides, explaining to people, who it is that's running, what the jobs are. And we get a tremendous amount of audience for those. But sadly, I think that's because the local daily newspaper largely doesn't do that kind of work anymore. And local television has totally abandoned that ground. I think that's been sort of reinvigorating for me to see that there is this demand for this kind of information. Having said that, I think we're having success better informing people who are already deeply engaged to give them the sense that they're casting informed ballots. We still have a lot of work to do in connecting with people who are more infrequent or just don't vote because they're just not being connected with, their voices are not being listened to. But there's definitely a demand out there for it if you approach this with a sense of humility and also a sense of community-driven purpose to try to get information out that voters are saying they need, rather than you on your high seat in your newspaper saying this is the information you need to know.
So, Hannah, so I think what we've heard from everybody really is the impact of revealing what's going on the ground, right? Telling the real story of what's going on the ground and how it affects real people. But do you also hear that people want that big picture too? And how do you balance those two things in your content?
Yeah, so I do kind of want to take a step back like Sara did as well, and just kind of tip my hat to the reporters that are with newspapers in the state of Florida. We have some really talented reporters here, and they do breaking news. They are on the ground. They're doing important work, but we kind of provide a niche that those outlets are not able to because of that slower approach, where we can take our time, we can work with communities, we can do listening sessions, we can cover things in a more in-depth way and not focus on that breaking news aspect. And I think just to go back to, sorry, I've been like holding up things I've been wanting to say here. The value of that is, right now that we're in this time that's fraught with complexity, and it demands new ways to tell stories, new ways to do journalism. And I think that all of us are in this position where we can experiment, we can try new things, like Dianna, hearing about the poet that you hired, what an amazing, like, beautiful project that is, and honestly really inspiring for us. And I think that's in the position where we're in now, where we're trying to meet those demands of our community by trying new things and by inviting them behind the curtain to show how we do this work whenever we can. Really include them in the process. And I think that, like, we have a small but, like, devoted, audience because of that. They're invested in what we do because they can see themselves in it, and they can see how it's done and that there's a place for them in it. So I think we want to, kind of addressing your questions as we move forward, we really want to rely on that community to help guide us. What do they want? What stories do they want to be told? And, how can we be better in representing them, that public service side of journalism, really giving them what they need.
I do think that's a big change in journalism in the last, decade. I know certainly when some of us were coming up, it was us and we covered you, right? And and we set the agenda and we covered you the way we wanted to. And that was sort of how it used to be. And that has changed, I think, enormously in all kinds of newsrooms over certainly the last 10 or 20 years. I want to talk, as we begin to wrap up and hopefully go to some of those questions that have been coming in. I wanted to talk about some victories that you all have had. Tell us a little bit about a difference you feel like you've been able to make in your communities with your coverage. And anybody, please jump in.
I'll start with, I think, just a classic impact of journalism story. During the pandemic, the city of El Paso furloughed many of its employees, but its entire library staff, shut down the library system with an understanding that, as health conditions improve, they'd reopen and bring these workers back. But a year into the pandemic, the city made a decision without any public input that they were just going to lay off the entire library staff, which would have dismantled a century-old public library system. Our reporter had built trust with the library employees, and they came to her when they got their layoff notices. The reporter, Ella de Pettis, did a story informing the public of what was going on. And within a day, the city reversed its decision. So local journalists doing her job and building trust resources and being tied into the community saved the city's public library system by doing the fundamentals of journalism. That's why we need good journalism in communities. This is one example of many.
Sara, do you have a thought about a big impact that you all have been able to have?
Yeah, for sure. Largely because when we really decide to invest in a story, that's really the first question we ask ourselves. What's at least the potential for impact? Because you don't know, of course, if it's going to have impact or just, blow away in the wind, but at least you can imagine that it has that potential. So a couple years, I guess this is one of the most dramatic examples of it. We had a reporter, a Navajo reporter, who told us that there was these massive industrial-sized greenhouses going up on the Navajo Nation, where the traditional crop is corn and, has been for centuries. And these greenhouses were filled with hemp. Actually, they were really high-grade cannabis. And it was just tons and tons of it. And the Navajo didn't want these, the cannabis. In fact, there was huge opposition to it. And then we learned, we sent a reporter in, and he spent an enormous amount of time there, and a photographer. And what we learned was that there were many Chinese immigrants coming in from Los Angeles. And for the most part, these were waiters and, restaurant people who had been laid off because of the pandemic, and they were coming in. They didn't have jobs in Los Angeles, and they were being bussed in by these investors to work the farms, and essentially being labor trafficked to do so, and put up in like terrible situations. And there was a lot of conflict with the Navajo, who were opposed to the, you know, to the farming of so much cannabis. And then we learned that there were also children who were being trafficked and, you know, brought in to work. So we did quite a few stories about this, and it resulted in, I'm not sure how many federal and state investigations. Wow. Many, like the State Department, ICE, the Attorney General's office. It's still going on.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Hannah, how are you guys feeling like you're making a difference with your stories?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. One story that's coming to my mind that I think was especially impactful for us, we published a few years ago, called A Sugarcane Boiling Point. And this story was about sugarcane pre-harvest burns in South Florida. So we have a large sugarcane farming industry in Florida. And the burns that are associated with harvesting that crop produce a lot of smoke and have been linked to environmental health impacts. And we covered that story a few years ago, pretty early on, tried to take a unifying approach, as I was talking about before, where we talked about, you know, those public health impacts. And we also talked about we interviewed a multi-generational farmer who had been, you know, farming sugarcane, and tried to point out the values that were shared between those, you know, seemingly opposing sides. And since then, there's been a lot more coverage about sugarcane farming and pre-harvest burns in South Florida. ProPublica has invested a lot of funds in it. So I'm not sure if the direct ties there, but I think we were pretty early on in covering that story. And there has also been a lot of legislative considerations that have changed since that first report that we did.
Oh no, that's a great example. I was just actually a judge in a journalism contest, and some of those stories were about this very, very issue. And you probably got that ball rolling for sure. Dianna?
These are fantastic stories. I can't wait to go read them. Let's see, making a difference. I'll say two things. One, very briefly, is Rashad Thomas, the poet artist that I mentioned. I've known him for many years. He's been working to find a place to be able to write, and I'm exceedingly passionate about putting our time and energy where we say we want our time and energy to be in, and in working through and getting that piece published, he's had some opportunities and some offers because people are rethinking the way that we can partner with people that may not have a traditional journalism background. As Sara said, working with Alicia, I think you said, right? Alicia Garza. So that is, to me, a major impact. I hope to be able to one day see him working full time. But that leads me probably to the second one, is resource. The idea of going back to 1990 and having 22 journalists per capita in Arizona to now having approximately 3. We used to always talk about the competition drove us to be better, and it benefited our community, right? The more journalists you had out there, the more newsrooms you had out there, the more widely and richly covered your communities were. And so now, when we look at things like Uvalde and national and local journalists coming in that need to really dig deep on every single level, there is a need for people that can be dedicated and have the resources for breaking news. And there is a need for a nonprofit newsroom that can say, we're staying, we're here, we're not leaving this issue. And so when you look at that way of partnering together, I would say for us, a win really was a story about Tucson during the pandemic, like many cities nationally, went fare free on their public transit system. No fares. It really came down to when buses had to shut down to keep the driver safe. and the people, passengers farther back. They cut off the fare end, and so it was almost necessary through safety procedures for COVID, right? Most of the cities that did that then transitioned out of that, either by putting some safety shields in, by saying, oh, we decided numbers are better, whatever reasons, including in Arizona, all the cities went back to charging a fare. Tucson decided to invest some of its funding in continuing fare free. And so I always talk about local journalism being national journalism with more heart. These are issues that matter in this community and then can be mattering to everybody, whether it's across the I-10 or across our nation. So for us, this became a story of, here is Tucson, here are communities that have spoken up and said, why can't we keep this? Can we talk about keeping this? But the daily coverage from the traditional news orgs was really about the money rather than about reimagining public transit, thinking from solutions, right? Thinking about your community, saying what are the solutions we want, and then looking nationally, are there? So we took that approach with the story. We got so much feedback about, thank you for opening a discourse instead of reporting on what the city is saying only, or what we're only doing here. You allowed us to be informed with a public discourse. So that conversation is going on as we speak. We'll have another story this week. But that is a win, because we have to take that step back. If that's truly what we say we do, is deeper dives, and we're here for the long run, then how can we look at that issue both locally, statewide, and nationally?
Yeah, you know, that is a great example. And this has been a terrific discussion. You know, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think the through line really is that, you know, how are you getting the word out, right, with community engagement and outreach to maybe humanitarian or nonprofit groups? How are people finding out about what you're doing to grow your audiences, to amplify these stories? What are there things that you can do, and are there tips that you have for other people who might want to do similar things in their own communities? Like, what if I wanted to start a nonprofit news organization? What would you recommend to get that word out there? How do I do it?
Take a deep breath and decide if you really, really, really want to do it. Getting the word out has been such a challenge. I think we're finally, after 4.5 years, turning the bend around that. But our model for publication and, you know, our reason for being almost has worked against us for getting known. And I'll tell you why. It's because, you know, we send our stories out to every news organization in the state of New Mexico. And I can't tell you how many times I've met people who've said to me, who've never heard of Searchlight, and people in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, and they say things like, I read a story in the Albuquerque Journal about whatever. You should write about that. And it was our story.
Yeah.
And that has happened so many times. And it's because, honestly, the newspapers that publish our stories don't always do a good job of making it apparent who wrote the story.
Yeah, you know, it's very flattering in a way, right? But on the other hand, it's not great. I do think, though, as we are all bombarded with content 24/7, and it's coming at us from so many places. Look, I'm a lifelong journalist and I care about who actually produced what. Sometimes I can't remember, though, where did I read something, because it's all coming in, and, you know, on your screen, it's all kind of the same, right? It's different from physically picking up a newspaper where you knew where you saw it. But I totally see that problem. I don't know, Bob or Dianna, Hannah, how are you?
The one thing I want to say is, I think it's important how we frame this issue. This is not a journalism problem. This is a community problem. And journalism in and of itself is a means. It is not an end. And I think as journalists, we probably too frequently treat it as an end. I think the driving force of community-based nonprofit news has to be rooted in the community. And so community foundations have to step up to be part of this. We need to make sure that we're being inclusive, you know, and I'll be totally honest. I mean, I had help from the community foundation here, which was invaluable, but I didn't do as good a job building out community support as I could have. And the pandemic scrambled everything up too. But I think if we begin all of this with a community-centric approach, and it helps. And it can't just be journalists saying, people need journalism. We're important for democracy. You know, that's true, but it's missing the point. So I think the first thing we have to do as we start this movement, and it needs to grow, is that it has to come from the community up, and to break that traditional model of news organizations sitting somewhere up high on the hill and looking out over what the community is. We have to be right there at the ground level, and that's where this has to come from.
Well, Hannah and Dianna, maybe some final thoughts from you all.
I would say being in year one, I see my friends here, and take a deep breath. What I will say is the conversation that you have with individuals, to ask them what are you missing from your local news? Why don't you trust your local news? That has to be bred literally who you are as an organization. And then I would say having those conversations with your community foundation, with your community leaders, really with your community leaders, because they're going to speak to the community foundation as well. In places like Arizona, where we've had this kind of slow growth of nonprofit, Arizona for Community Investigative Reporting, some of the Substacks, Arizona Agenda, you'll see this kind of small growth, but it's been so small that the traditional way is, if we just invest more in this, local news organizations, that's the way that people have thought about it. And we have to be able to speak with the community leaders, people who, already invest in their community, people who invest for child welfare, people who have invested in education. We have so many people in our states who care so deeply about people having the same opportunities that they have had, and they see that drifting away. Mm-hmm. I want people to be able to grow up the way that I did. I want people to be able to own a house like I did. So many of these stories are over like I did. And so those conversations with that community wave of people, and then going to your community foundation, and then going to your larger community, basically the, so-called car dealerships, for lack of a better word, and saying, what matters to you. And you'll hear it often, schools, education, even in a state that's 49th, 50, 48th quite often. And so I say that little anecdote is that if you are going to do this, you have to have so many conversations before you even walk into the door of the Arizona Community Foundation, or the Florida Community Foundation, or the New Mexico Community Foundation, or the Texas Community Foundation.
Okay, Hannah, you get the last word on growing this, getting that word out there, amplifying your messages.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, the Community Foundation piece has been really important for us as well. We're actually have a matching grant right now we're fundraising for, and that support is like everything to us. We've kind of realized recently that it's been difficult during the past couple of years with the pandemic, because we're focused on local communities, but we haven't been able to really go out and engage in person like we really need to be. And especially having a small team, and Florida's quite, a large state. So that's something like being in person, reaching people that way. Events like this is helpful. Just being part of discussions and really letting people see your face and see what your values are, I think is an important way, but that growing an audience piece is really difficult. There is, I wanted to note, kind of a new thing that at least we're experiencing. We just got a grant from the Pulitzer Center to cover a story about Egmont Key, which is an important historical site for the Seminole tribe of Florida. And we are working with Seminole tribal members to tell that story. And the Pulitzer Center, you know, aside from that grant, also offers outreach funding. So after the story is done, we can apply for additional funds to work with the Seminole tribe to put that story out there, host an event, you know, that kind of thing where you're actually in the community talking about it. So I think that that kind of innovative approach from funders is a really important piece as well. You know, kind of like Bob was saying, the impetus is not just on us, but on the community and those surrounding us as well to help fund this model.
Well, and that's a great point. I mean, all of these stories have really long tails, right? And there is an ability to build around that content to have it have a much bigger impact and reach communities of readers and users that you might not have initially reached. And that's what I hope we're going to be able to do with a recording of this podcast and get it out there. And I just want to thank this wonderful panel for amplifying so many important issues that we are seeing all over the country, as well as across, you know, this amazing highway that cuts this transect through the fastest growing, some most important parts of our country, and really bringing to life all of these important issues. And Duke, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And to your last point there, I think what this conversation has confirmed for us is that the whole country should pay attention to this geography. The richness of this discussion, the stories that aren't necessarily being heard at the national level the way that they should be, are obvious as a result of this conversation. And I think, again, the rest of the nation can learn from what you're experiencing in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida. And so many things you're describing are emergent. They haven't been around for hundreds of years in a certain way, and you're building new organizations reflecting this region. So I just want to thank Sara, Hannah, Dianna, and Bob, and especially Susan for pulling this together. I would conclude by saying another thing. Tenacross has enjoyed enormous support from community foundations. I didn't anticipate that all of you would mention them, many of whom we know, and we work with some of them in your cities. And the connection between local journalism and community foundations, I think, can't be overstated. And I'm just glad to see that connection being made. I'll conclude by saying we haven't been able to do in-person events for some time because of COVID, as you all know. And so we are going to begin doing that again. We'll be in Houston later this year, the fourth largest city in the United States. I think it's a perfect place to bring many of you back together, talk about the issues that you've brought up today. So for people interested in Tenacross, be looking forward to that invitation. So again, thanks to the four of our great panelists. Thank you, Susan, our wonderful moderator, and everyone for contributing to a really vital discussion. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.